Hi, my name is Joey Lovestrand. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow at SOAS, University of London. This is a presentation for the WOCAL10 workshop on associated motion in African languages, looking at associated motion and related directionals in Chadic languages. The outline is fairly straightforward. I'll say a few words about the definitions of associated motion and directionals, introduce Chadic languages, and then we'll look at directional markers in Chadic languages and a secondary use of directional markers to express subsequent motion in Chadic languages. Then we'll look at multi-verb constructions expressing prior motion in Chadic languages before a brief conclusion. So on associated motion and directionals, won't go into too many details, assuming that people who are part of this workshop already know the basics. But I'm essentially following the approach to associated motion and directionals from this recent edited volume, where associated motion is defined as a verbal grammatical category whose function is to associate in different ways different kinds of translational motion to what is normally a non-motion verb event. One example of that is this example of associated motion morphology in Convinia in South America, taken from Antoine Guillaume's work. We have a verb root ba, meaning see, and there are certain kinds of suffixes that can be attached to this word, adding motion to it. So if you add the suffix t, it would mean go and see, or expressing motion before the event of seeing, or now would mean come and seeing, also expressing motion, but in a different direction before seeing. Directionals, on the other hand, they modify the meaning of motion predicates. So they normally will go with a verb that already has a motion meaning, and they add more specific information about the direction of the path of motion, such as the deitic orientation being towards, away from the deitic center in the sense of go and come. So one example of this from a Chadic language, Southern Giziga, if you look at the verb kill, run, on its own, it doesn't express any particular direction. But with the ventive directional, the suffix o, klo, it means to come running or to run here. So you have a motion verb that's given a certain deitic orientation. These orientations can go in many different directions. So it's an example from another Chadic language, Lamang, which is said to have around 17 motion-related suffixes, sometimes called extensions. And these can include more complex directions, into or out of, vertical directions or cardinal directions, up, east, down, west, etc., etc. Morphemes with directional meanings often have additional meanings in other contexts, and this is often determined by the lexical semantics of the predicate, or it can be something that's lexicalized and unpredictable or idiomatic. So a morpheme that expresses directionality, typically derived from a verb called come, might also have benefactive meanings or perfective meanings or encodative meanings. But in this particular study, I was only looking at the meanings related to motion. So that's specifically the ventive, the deitic directional meanings, and a related meaning of subsequent motion that many of these directionals also express in Chadic languages. To say a few words about Chadic languages are part of the Afroasiatic family, so distantly related to other families like Semitic and Berber. Basically a three-way split in three major groups, the West, the Central, and the East Chadic languages, as you see on the map here. There is another smaller group, the Masa languages, which are a group of 10 languages that are argued to be a separate subgroup. But you can see that West and Central are the largest groups of languages with the 75 and 81 languages in those groups according to Glottolog, and 36 languages in the East Chadic group. This map is taken from the Glottoscope, which is another feature of Glottolog, and it shows the relative level of documentation of each of the languages on the map. So this is a map showing the position of all of the Chadic languages, and the color of the marker for each language shows the level of documentation from red to green. But this one is currently looking at the view from 1921, 100 years ago. And I created a short video that will show in about 10 seconds the progress at about 1 second per decade on how Chadic languages have been documented over the years. So that's starting in 1921. We see slow bits of progress in description of languages of Northern Cameroon and Nigeria, more and more grammars. And then we see recent, in the last couple of decades, many more grammars of languages being written all across the Chadic languages. So there's been quite a bit of increase in description of Chadic languages in the last 20 years or so. These are the numbers from Glottolog for the descriptive status of all the different Chadic languages. So specifically, we see that at the level of having at least a grammar sketch, there's 22% of the languages have a grammar sketch. And then an additional 23% have a full grammar. So about 45% of the languages are at that level of grammar sketch or grammar. This is relevant for the description of directions and associated motion, because directionality and subsequent motion are typically expressed through verbal morphology. So that information would be available for languages that may just have a grammar sketch. But information about prior motion, which is typically expressed in multi-verb constructions, is normally only available for languages that have a full grammar. So maybe only 23% of the languages would have information about prior motion and how that's expressed in the language. Of course, I wasn't able to access all of the grammars that are available, but I was able to look at these 49 languages for this study. So to go directly to the distribution of directionals across the 49 Chadic languages that I was able to look at. First, I'll mention some recent previous work by Russell Hsu. This was a book that was published posthumously by Paul Newman, something that Hsu was working on. And there's a section in the book looking at directionals. And Hsu's summary is that in West Chadic, you have directionals that will only have one deictic meaning. Basically, it'll just be one directional marker and it will be the ventive meaning. It's coming towards the deictic center. Whereas languages of the Central Chadic languages have a larger range of directional suffixes with a larger range of more specific meanings in terms of the orientation of the motion. Hsu didn't have much to say about East Chadic languages, included just 2 languages, mentioned that there may be a directional particle in Kara, but then looked at auxiliary verbs in Dangla that actually express prior associated motion, not directionality. So those 2 categories are conflated briefly in Hsu's description. My study, I'm able to look at quite a few more languages than Hsu looked at. So the languages here in red are the ones that were not covered in Hsu 2017. And now looking at where directionals are found. So of the 20 Central Chadic languages, we find that all of them have directionals. None of those languages were said to not have any directional suffixes. In 10 of those languages, there is only a ventive-itive distinction maximally, or maybe just a ventive, so either 1 or 2 directionals. But in another 9 languages, there's 3 or more or other different kinds of directional meanings, besides just towards and away from the deictic center. One Central Chadic language is actually a Masa language here, Peve, has directional multi-verb constructions rather than a suffix. Directional is also very common in West Chadic languages. Of the 19 languages looked at, only 4 of them were said not to have a directional form of the verb or directional suffix. The other 14 are said to have a ventive suffix, and 2 languages are said to have directional multi-verb constructions. If you're doing the math, the reason why there are 20 different categories is, for 19 languages is because the language Pero is described as having both a ventive suffix and a directional multi-verb construction. In East Chadic languages, we find a different story. Of the 10 languages I was able to look at, for 6 of them, there doesn't appear to be any sort of directional suffix or any other way of expressing directionals where you combine this meaning with a motion verb in the grammar. Only 1 language, Shokoro, has a ventive suffix, and 3 languages have directional multi-verb constructions. Just to give an example of directional multi-verb construction, this is an example from Bahrain, where we see a serial verb construction with the verb run followed by the verb come in the first example, meaning he ran back or ran here. In the second example, run followed by the verb to go up. You ran up into the tree. This is a map showing the distribution of directionals in Chadic languages. So we see that the white are where there are no directionals found, the black directional MVCs. The blue is where there is a directional, but it's either only ventive or ventive and itive. And the red are the languages that have more directional meanings beyond just ventive and itive. So we see that those are all Central Chadic languages that cluster on the Nigeria-Cameroon border. One interesting directional marker is found in the language Lele, spoken in southern Chad. Frajzyngier describes this language as having a marker expressing movement away, which is derived from the form for the word bush, that's the wilderness, the African bush, following the verb. And this is atypical because directions are normally described as being derived from motion verbs come or go. But we see in the first example, the verb run, also followed by go, but then followed by bush. So that might be interpreted as a literal interpretation of going to location, the bush. But in the second example, we see what's obviously not a literal interpretation, what is apparently an itive interpretation of this word. I clean the blood away. So clean appears as the verb appearing with this itive marker derived from the word for the bush. Next, we'll talk a bit about how subsequent associated motion gets expressed in some Chadic languages. And this goes back to the work of Aisha Bakaldi in 2015 paper and subsequent work, describing directional markers in African languages that also have an associated motion meaning, typically a subsequent motion meaning. And her paper included 3 examples of Chadic languages, Hausa, Lele, and Pero. So here's an example from Newman's Grammar of Hausa. The directional form is the ending O on the verb. So the verb harbo shot in the first example, that's shoot with a directional form, shoot at me, shoot towards the didactic center being the speaker. But in the second example with the verb to buy, with the same O suffix, what we get instead of directionality is what can be interpreted as motion after the action of buying. So he bought and then came back. So it's a subsequent motion interpretation. It's also very clear in the description of Moloko by Diane Friesen, 2017, where the enclitic Allah, here glossed as to, the preposition to, well, the interpretation is clearly directional. So we have the verb go with this Allah, and here we have a ventive interpretation. So we have what appears to be a general motion verb glossed as go with a ventive suffix. So it becomes coming, moving towards the didactic center. The same ending Allah when appearing with the verb eat in the second example can be seen as an example of subsequent motion. So the interpretation given is I already ate over there at someone else's house before I arrived here. And that could be reframed as I ate and then came, or I ate before coming. So subsequent motion after the action of eating. Looking for examples of subsequent associated motion in the data on these 49 languages, find that of the languages that are said to have some kind of directional marker, most of them are not said to have a subsequent interpretation, although that may be underreporting if this is something that wasn't explicitly examined in the study. But looking at West Chadic languages, where there are 15 languages that have directional forms, 4 of those 15 are said to have a subsequent interpretation. In the Central Chadic languages, 6 of the 20 languages with directional forms said to also have a subsequent interpretation. And there's just 1 language in East Chadic where there's a multi-verb construction, which is said to also have a possible subsequent motion interpretation besides its directional interpretation. So here we see again a map where the white symbols are languages that don't have any directionals. The blue are those that have directional without a subsequent motion interpretation. And the red are those that do have subsequent motion interpretation. So there's not any clear clustering of where subsequent motion appears. It looks fairly widespread across the different branches. It's not certain how common it is, as it may be underreported, but it certainly does exist in many different Chadic languages. Well, again, subsequent motion is always a secondary function of the directional markers. It's typically restricted to the ventive directional marker, even in languages that have more directionals besides the ventive. So even when you have many directional markers, it's typically only the ventive that can get a subsequent motion interpretation. An exception to this is the description of Hidi, where there's a subsequent motion interpretation of an upwards directional. as well as an example of what appears to be subsequent itive motion of an object. So first looking at the subsequent upward motion, this is the example given in Frajzyngier. This is not discussed in a lot of detail, but this, here we have the verb cut, which appears to be followed by an allative suffix and then an upward directional suffix. And the interpretation given is that they slaughtered a cow and took it to a place at a higher level. So that would be a subsequent motion upwards after the act of cutting. And this is the example given of potentially a subsequent itive motion of an object. Here we have another directional, this one glossed away, and the verb see. The interpretation given is he saw me pass by at the market, but this could also be reframed as he saw me and then I left and I went away. So motion away after the event of seeing. Now looking at prior associated motion in Chadic languages, this is typically expressed through multi-verb constructions as it is in many languages of the world. So again, this is an example from Bahrain, where through a story we see serial verb constructions like go, put, come, put, where the narrator is giving information about the relative location of events by using prior motion serial verb constructions to express that there was some change of location before events took place in the story. There's much less information about this, and as you can imagine, this is something that's certainly hard to find negative evidence of. It's not something that descriptions usually will explicitly say doesn't exist, and so there may be under-reporting, or there may just be not as common in Chadic languages as it is elsewhere. But for those languages where we're able to find some reasonable amount of information, where we would expect to find discussion of multi-verb constructions, you do see that many of these languages do have some kind of prior motion multi-verb construction, more often a type of auxiliary construction where an auxiliary verb combines with a non-finite verb, non-finite form of the following verb. In East Chadic, this in all 5 languages where I was able to find a reasonable description, they all seem to have this kind of construction. In Central Chadic languages, 10 of the 15 languages I looked at had this kind of construction, in 4 of the 6 West Chadic languages. So again, we can't really be very certain about the quantity or the frequency of this suffix, this kind of expression of prior motion across languages. What we do see is relatively common, and that it's widespread in all 3 groups, West, Central, and East. There is some discussion in 2 grammars, the Hindi grammar and the Gomai grammar, about whether a particular prior motion multi-verb construction should be interpreted as prior motion or some kind of translocative. And the issue is how we should interpret cases of repetition. So in this example from, I believe it's from Hindi, Frajzyngier describes a case where the verb la, gloss go, is given in a phrase. So in the first part of this sentence, we see the hyena goes. And then what follows it is, again, the verb go in this multi-verb construction followed by the verb put on fire. And Frajzynger's point is that, well, if you already said hyena went in the first clause, then the repetition of the verb go in the next clause must not be saying exactly the same thing. It must have some other locational meaning and not a motion meaning. See a similar argument in Helvig's work on Gomai in 2011 grammar, that what's called a deictic serial construction is used to code the deictic setting of an event, and specifically says that it does not express a sequence such as come and find, but deixis find here. And the argument is based on examples like the one seen here, where we see in the subordinate clause that the subject comes, we see the verb come, and then the verb come followed by talk in the next clause. And I say that this kind of repetition shows that the come talk is not actually saying the motion again, but it must be some kind of deictic marker like here. However, if looking at how common what's called echo phenomenon is in descriptions of associated motion in the languages, we do find this kind of repetition often, even in cases where associated motion is expressed morphologically. So this is an example from Japug, where we see the verb go used in a clause, so the subject goes, and then the following verb is the verb look, marked with an associated prior motion marker, go and do. So we say go, go and look. And so we get this kind of repetition that happens, which is sort of like an agreement phenomenon where you repeat something. And even though there's repetition here, this doesn't necessarily mean that the morphology on the second verb is somehow not really a prior motion marker. So I think we can find, at least I find, that the examples of repetition don't necessarily rule out an interpretation of a construction as expressing prior motion. Repetition and redundancy exists all over the place, and while it is possible that some of these markers don't express prior motion, but rather some kind of translocative, non-motion locational meaning, I think we need more than just repetition to show that that is in fact the case. So just to say a few words in conclusion, first summarizing some of the basic trends. Prior motion multi-verb constructions are very common in all Chadic languages across the three major subgroups. Directional suffixes are very common, particularly in West and Central Chadic. In West Chadic languages, these directionals are ventive only, while in Central Chadic, there are certain languages that seem to have more meanings beyond just a basic ventive and itive distinction. It's also relatively common for directional suffixes to have subsequent motion interpretation, although this is normally only true of ventive directionals. Looking broadly at the patterns of distribution of ventive and itive, find that if there is only one directional motion meaning, that will always be a ventive meaning, where if there's only one prior motion meaning, in 3 of 4 cases, that's only an itive meaning. So we see a correlation here between ventive with directional forms and a preference for itive with prior motion forms. And that's the same pattern that occurs across associated motion and directional affixes cross-linguistically. Continually see this correlation or this preference for ventive with directionals and itive with prior motion. And finally, there are 2 rather exceptional forms that were found in the Chadic languages data. One is the itive directional form that's formed from a noun, meaning the bush in Lele, and the other is the use of an upward directional to express upward subsequent motion in Chidi. There are still several other issues, possibly under-reporting, particularly of subsequent motion functions of directional markers, very likely under-reporting of functions of multi-verb constructions in these languages that aren't typically examined in much detail. Other issues that aren't discussed here include the further meaning of directional markers beyond just the 2 basic motion meanings discussed here, including idiomatic interpretations that seem to be very common. Further research might look into interactions between lexical semantics and the interpretations, particularly of the markers that are ambiguous between directional and subsequent motion interpretations. Thank you very much for listening. Here are my sources and references.